South Alabama. Are you in that song about the... This is a class, you may recall, on Ezra and Nehemiah. We fairly well finished up looking into Nehemiah last week. I wanted to review and kind of put us all in a ready context so that we could move right into Nehemiah without too much of a problem. Everybody get a worksheet that wants one? I would not in any way say that I've covered all the bases with these 7 questions, but I've tried to get enough information in this that we can round up our understanding of what's going on in this period of Israel's history. So let's just get into it and see how much you remember. And if we're ready to go, proceed from here. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are about the return of Israelites from captivity in Babylon to Jerusalem. Ezra records the return to rebuild the temple, while Nehemiah is about the return to rebuild the walls around the city. The return to rebuild the temple took place in about 539 BC, while the return to rebuild the wall was in about 444 BC. If you do the math, you'll find this is a difference of about, anybody got it? I got 95, is that right? Anybody else figure that out? 94 in 8 months? That was Donnie, by the way. Figured that out with his steel trap mind. If he could just get it open. Number 2, there were blank major deportations of Jews. Anybody know? Did we even discuss that? I thought we did. There were 3 major deportations of Jews from Judea to Babylon between the years 606 and 586 BC. Some say 605, but talking about 2,600 years ago, I don't want to get too. You can read of these in 2 Kings 24 and 25. By this time, the 10 northern tribes, usually referred to as Israel, had long before been taken into Assyrian captivity. Assyrian, Assyrian. Assyrian captivity. This happened around 722 BC. Number 3, God had prophesied through Jeremiah that Judah would be in Babylonian captivity for blank years. 70 years. At that point, he promised to blank Babylon, punish Babylon, and return his people to Jerusalem. And there are the scriptural notations where you can go and read about that 70-year prophecy. The ending of the 70-year captivity is also mentioned by the prophet. And it's in his writings, of course, it says that 9:1-2. You remember reading from Daniel? Daniel was reading from the prophet Jeremiah and read about Jeremiah's prophecy regarding the 70-year captivity. Daniel and his 3 companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were some of those taken into Babylonian captivity. Isaiah was the prophet who specifically named blank as the king who would commission the Jews to return. King Cyrus. I'll mention here again, it may be a little confusing because Cyrus was the Persian king who conquered Babylon, but who did Cyrus put on the throne in Babylon once he had conquered Babylon? Darius. Now, how many Dariuses were there? There were 3. This was Darius the Mede. Darius the Mede, because later on you'll read about Darius, King Darius doing this and doing that, and you're then at that point reading about Darius the Great. So just like we've got several Kennedys, we have several Dariai. Yeah. That's the way that kind of works out. Isaiah was the prophet who specifically named Cyrus as the king who would commission the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And he did that in chapter 44:28 in through chapter 45 and verse 7. Isaiah's prophetic career, I don't like to refer to it as a career, but just for lack of a better term, was from about 740 to 680 BC. But Cyrus did not become king of Persia until around 559 BC. This is a difference of around, and if you do the math, it'll be 121 years. If I did the math right. So 121 years before Cyrus ascended the throne of Persia, God, through Isaiah, said, my servant Cyrus is going to send my people back. And by the way, if that was 120 years before Cyrus sent them back, what hadn't even happened yet? They hadn't even been taken into captivity. Pretty interesting, huh? How did God know all this stuff? Well, maybe a better question is, how did Isaiah know it all? Well, Isaiah didn't know it. God just said, write this down. Number 6, Ezra did not return with the initial group who came to rebuild the temple, but came later under the direction of, anybody get this king? This is where you put in Artaxerxes. Well, I don't have to because I very wisely put him, the first word, in the next sentence. See how smart I am? I'm so proud of that. Artaxerxes commissioned Ezra's trip to chronicle the work around 457 BC, which is around 82 years from the time the first group left under Cyrus. I don't know about you, but I try to put all these dates and these kings and the time spans together, and it gets kind of confusing. And about the time I get everything in line in my own little mind, somebody bumps me, and then I forget it, and I got to come back and remind myself. That's why I want us to try to focus in this study, not just on the history, but primarily on the providential leading and guidance of God all the way through this, because it's just wild to me that all those years before Cyrus even came to the throne, Isaiah said, or God said through Isaiah, hey, Cyrus is going to be the one who brings them back. And they would have been reading and hearing Isaiah and said, wait a minute, what do you mean bring us back? We haven't even left. Well, you're going to see what's going to happen, and that's what came to be. And Israel is not a nation for 70 years in Judea and Jerusalem. They're gone. The city's left in ruins. The walls collapsed. The temple's burnt. All this stuff is gone. And Israel's in a foreign country, and then 7 years later, heathen pagan king says, y'all go back. And don't just go back. I'm just not turning you loose. I'm sending you back with royal funding to rebuild your temple and to reestablish Judaism. Okay? All right. Number 7. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not finished here. 82 years from the time the first group left under Cyrus. The first blank chapters of the book of Ezra, the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra chronicle the events preceding his arrival, as we are not introduced to him until chapter 7, verse 1. Artaxerxes was also the king who commissioned blank to return, who also returned Nehemiah. Nehemiah returned. We've already established that in previous questions, but he's the one who returned. So it's not like Ezra and Nehemiah went down together. They're both about the Jews returning to Jerusalem, but it's about 82 years apart. And Ezra didn't even go with the first bunch that went. He went much later than the first bunch. He came to chronicle what they had already done. Number 7, the initial group returning under Cyrus to rebuild the temple was led by, who was the leader? Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel. Guess what I put 2 lines down? Zerubbabel. I'm so clever. Don't ask me how I learned to do that. Spent a lot of time in class spelling out names. The initial group returning under Cyrus to rebuild the temple was led by Zerubbabel, who was the appointed governor of Judea. And for that, see Ezra 6:7 and Haggai 1:1. And blank, who was the high priest? Joshua. His name is next to Zerubbabel's. The boy's learning. He's picking stuff up. It's kind of scary, isn't it? When Zerubbabel and Joshua lost the initiative to build, based on a great deal of blank by the local inhabitants surrounding Jerusalem, what would you put in that blank? Conflict, opposition, resistance. The inhabitants, remember what the inhabitants wanted to do at first when Israel came back to rebuild the temple? What did they ask to do? We want to help. And what did Israel say? Or what did Zerubbabel and Joshua say? You guys don't have any part in this. This is our job. This is our doing. We are the Jews who've returned. You are not. We're doing this, and you ain't. So they didn't like that, and there was nothing but opposition from them from there on out. God sent the prophets, blank and blank, to fire them up again. This is when Zerubbabel and Joshua lost the initiative to keep building. Who did God send? Haggai and Zechariah. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah were the two that God sent to get things going again. Hopefully, with this, we've brought enough facts in and concepts of the time and the passage of time, because everybody didn't come back at once. They came back in stages, just like they left in stages. They came back in stages. They came back first to rebuild the temple, and then they came back later to rebuild the wall, and there was a lot of downtime in there. So, any observations, any questions or comments? Yes?
They're supposed to get rid of the foreign wives and their children and all that.
Yes.
And I asked the question, what happened to them? And of course, we realized in order to be back in a good relationship with God, they had to depart from them and stuff like that. Thinking about that and what's going on in the East and being over in Afghanistan and seeing some of the things, the intermarriage among them, they took care of themselves. And then Ezra 10:44 said, and they departed. That's all it said. I was kind of wondering what happened to these people after God told us, Israel people, like whoever, to depart from these people. Well, you'd have to consider the fact that they left and married among themselves again, took care of their own families, because if not, they're just going to perish out there because they have nobody to take care of.
Right. And they asked, they said, hey, it's the rainy season. We got a bunch of people involved in this. So they did it over time and with some degree of compassion. And I don't know what the final outcome was. I don't know that there's any historical record that tells us. We do know that a people came to be who were called the Samaritans. And they are probably the folks who were left. I don't remember. Look at 2 Kings 24 and 25. I think this is where I read this today. But it was about the best and strongest. Yes. 2 Kings 24. These are about the deportations from Judah to Babylon. Look at 2 Kings 24:10. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, went up to Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his captains and his officials. So the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, just as the Lord had said. Then he led away into exile all Jerusalem, and all the captains, and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen, and the smiths. What's a smith? What would a smith be? A metal worker, somebody who who made things, created things. None remained except who? The poorest people of the land. So all the capable people were taken back to Babylon, and they left only those that they didn't think had anything to add to Babylon. So those were the people who were left in the country. And the idea of the Samaritans is that they intermingled with Gentiles, and perhaps it was, I don't want to speculate and say for sure, but maybe some of these wives that were turned loose from those who returned intermarried with other folks around there, and as a result, somehow, there was a mixed breed, so to speak. And you and I both know there's no such thing as a mixed breed human being. If you're a human being, you're made in the image of God. But as far as Israel was concerned, and the purity of the nation was concerned, the Samaritans were a mixed breed. And I always think about Cher and that song, half-breed, that's all I ever heard. Half-breed, how I learned to hate the word. That's what the Samaritans were. I know, you can laugh, you can chuckle. I don't know if you're laughing at the song or at my rendition. Yeah. Hey, that was a big song when I was a teenager. What's that? Don't have enough hair. Yeah. Well, I ain't even going to touch that one. But that's what's going on with the Samaritans. And so there was this animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans that remained up until the time of Christ. And you remember in John chapter 4, Jesus was talking with the woman at the well. She was a Samaritan woman. And what did Jesus tell her about their way of worship? Well, first, what did she say about it? What did she admit and reveal about their worship? So we worship at Mount Gerizim, and you all worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, you don't know what you worship. We worship what we know to be truth, Jesus said, for salvation is of the Jews. In no uncertain terms. He didn't mince words with her. Somewhat like John the Baptist, who called those who came out to him a generation of vipers, a brood of vipers. Said, you need to repent. Axes laid to the root of the trees. That's the kind of preaching that they heard. That's the kind of confrontation that Jesus made because he wanted to make an impact on this woman's mind, and he did. She left there believing he was a prophet, went back, told the townspeople. They came out. They believed that Jesus, they listened to Jesus and heard him at that point. Which is, when you think about it, that's what this whole book is about. Who's going to believe God? Who is going to believe God? You start in chapter 3 with Adam and Eve. They believed God for a while, and then let's try something new. And Eve goes off on a tangent and eats the forbidden fruit. Next thing you know, they've got 2 sons. One of them says, I'm not going to offer what I'm supposed to offer. Then I'm going to get upset at my brother because he's accepted and I'm not. I'm going to kill my brother. And then you get to chapter 6, and everybody has left the right way so much that God says, I'm going to send a flood and kill everybody except these 8 people. Well, those 8 people get everything together. And next thing you know, the people who are after the flood are building a tower to heaven in seeming rebellion to God. And God said, we can't have this. I'm going to confound your languages so you spread out all over the world. And they spread out all over the world. And God says, okay, it's time for me to start my plan to bring a Savior into the world. And he calls Abraham. And he says, I'm going to make of you a great nation. And through Abraham, 25 years later, he fulfills his promise, gives him Isaac. And, you know the story from there. And we finally get up to, here we are in Israel, and they're finally brought back because they sinned, were taken into captivity, they repented, they were brought back. There's a lot of stuff here. All right. Billy, it's your fault for getting us off on that. I blame you. Yeah. All right, let's look at Nehemiah Chapter 1. Need some readers for 1 through 3, the first 3 verses. Who's got it? James, you want to take it? And Kim, if you'll get 8 through 11. No, 4 through 7. I don't know how to count yet. Kim's got 4 through 7. Bobby, will you get 8 through 11? All right. Let's read the first chapter of Nehemiah and see where we are. Bless you.
One of my brothers came, he and his certain men of Judea, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem, and they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity that are there in the apartments are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burning with fire.
Now it came about, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Let thine ear now be attentive, and thine eyes open to hear the prayer of thy servant, which I am praying before thee now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, thy servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have sinned against thee. I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against thee, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which thou didst command thy servant Moses.
Remember, I pray, the Lord, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out into the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and will bring them to a place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. For I was the king's cupbearer.
All right. Who is the king? We just talked about this briefly in the worksheet. Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is the king. And it says in chapter 1, verse 1, in the 20th year. That's the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. So he's been king for 20 years. Hanani or Hanani, however his name is pronounced, and some men from Judah came. What kind of a report did they bring back? Now remember what's supposed to have been going on in Judah. The rebuilding of the temple. What kind of a report did they bring back when he asked them about that? It's not going well. And it doesn't say, there's nothing between the lines, there's no detailed revelation about what Nehemiah or other Jewish folks in Persia were expecting. But these guys have been gone for decades to rebuild the temple. It may be that they had high hopes that things were going great and everything was looking good, but that's not the report he's getting. The wall is broken down, the gates are burned with fire. Doesn't say anything about the temple at this point. The temple has been rededicated, but it doesn't say that. That's not what it talks about. How does he respond to that news? Sat down and he wept, mourned for days. What else was he doing? Fasting and praying before the God of heaven. What's his prayer? Acknowledgement of sin. This is one of the things that Ezra has done. Nehemiah is doing it. Daniel does the same in Daniel chapter 9. These are very spiritual, godly men, and they're looking at this whole circumstance saying, Lord, we've sinned. We have sinned greatly, and we understand that's why you have sent us off into captivity. But now we want to return. We want you to fulfill your promise to send us back. But there's no sense of, what's the word? No sense of, they are contrite. Can't think of the word. It's up there somewhere. They don't feel like God owes them. In other words, they're saying, we really messed up. We shouldn't have done what we did. But we do want to go back. Entitlement, yes, not entitled. There you go. However, look what he says in verse 8. He says, remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I'll scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote part of the heavens, I will gather them from there, and I will bring them to the place where I have chosen to cause my name to dwell. What is Nehemiah calling on here? What's that? Calling on God's grace, and he's calling on God's promise. This is what God had said to them back in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. He'd made this promise. If you don't keep my law, I'm going to scatter you to the four winds. But if you repent, I'll bring you back. And there's, okay, you're right. We messed up. But we want to come back. You said you'd bring us back. Will you do that? Will you bring us back? Verse 10, they're your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. Let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name and make your servant successful today. Grant him compassion before this man. Before what man? He was going before the king. He says, all right, we need to go back. I can't just run off. I got to go talk to the king. Grant us compassion before the king. All right. Questions, observations, anything? Chapter 2, let's do some reading. Need a reader for 1 through 5. Who'll take that? Donnie, you want to get 1 through 5? Yeah. Matt, you want to get 6 through 8? 9 through 10? Johnny? Bob, did you read? You haven't read. You've got one arm. Can you read with one arm? What have I assigned? Johnny, did I give you 9 and 10? Yes. So, Bob, you've got 11 to 16. Yeah, Rich, if you'll get 17 to 20, we'll finish out chapter 2.
In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of the king Art, when the wine was born, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why are your face sad? Seeing you are not sick, this is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad? When the city, the place of my father's grave lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to God in heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you sent me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it.
With the queen sitting beside him, the king asked me, how long will you be away, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I told him how long I would be gone. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may letters be given me addressed to the governors of the province beyond the river to allow me to travel to Judah. May the king also issue a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, directing him to supply me with timber for the beams of the temple fortress gates, for the city wall, and for the house in which I will live. The king gave me what I asked, for the gracious power of my God was with me.
Then I came to the governors beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me captains of the army and horsemen. And when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant and Ammonite heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly, for what there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel.
So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days.
And I arose in the night, and I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem, and there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So I went out at night by the valley gate in the direction of the Dragon's Well, and onto the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates which were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no place for my mount to pass. So I went up at night by the ravine and inspected the wall. Then I entered the valley gate and again and returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I as yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work.
Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah and the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "What, are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it."
Seems to be a theme, doesn't it? This is our business. What was Nehemiah's job? What's that? Okay, that was the job that the book mostly deals with, but what was his job in Persia? In the court of the king, he was the cupbearer. Don't you suppose there were some pretty decent Persian guys who could have done that? Who was Nehemiah? He's a Jewish guy. He was the cupbearer. How trustworthy do you suppose the cupbearer before the king had to be? He was somebody that, okay, Bob likes to say he's expendable. But he also had to be trustworthy because he could have tasted it and dropped something in it. He could have had the poison in his mouth and spit it into the cup. I mean, I know, it's gross. If you're going to kill somebody, it's okay to be gross. Okay, now that's a historic fact or idea that comes down to us from secular history. But he was a man who was in close service to the most powerful man in the world. He's a cupbearer in this context, as Donnie's pointing out, cupbearer for the Lord. Yeah, just like Joseph. When he came to power in Egypt, who was the only man higher than Joseph? Pharaoh was the only one. God put him in that position. He was serving in Pharaoh's court. If you ever heard that joke, where's the first reference to tennis in the Bible? That's where Joseph served in Pharaoh's court. All right. First motorcycle. Anybody know the first motorcycle? The sound of Moses' triumph was heard throughout the land. Anyway, don't get me started. It's too late. What was I talking about? Talking about Nehemiah being cupbearer to the king. Here's this Jewish guy. He's one of the captives, and he's serving in this close, responsible position before the king. Coincidence? It doesn't say. This is a great opportunity for God to brag and say, I'm the one that put him there. But God doesn't do that. It's just left up to us to think about it. Well, maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's not. What's on Nehemiah's heart? See, it's not just that you've got this Jewish guy who's serving so close to the king, and pretty close, because what does the king say when Nehemiah comes before him? I've never seen you sad before. How come you're sad, Nehemiah? Which ought to tell us something. He's a man of faith. A man of faith doesn't look sad all the time. When he does look sad, the king knows. The king knows. The king's paying attention to Nehemiah. And he says, how come you're sad? Is Nehemiah ready? Bobby?
You mentioned that it could have been a Persian that would
Yeah.
have done it. If it had been a Persian, nothing would have ever come up about going to rebuild Jerusalem either.
That's right.
That wouldn't have been their thought pattern at all.
So maybe Billy's right. Maybe there was some bit of providence involved in this. Yeah. How did Esther become queen of Persia? Oh, that's another story.
Providence of God.
So, when the king says, "What's on your mind, Nehemiah?" does Nehemiah have an answer? He's got an answer. He doesn't just tell him that he's upset. What does the king ask him when he tells him he's upset and what he's upset about? Yeah, what's your request? Verse 4, the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, read the next few verses that were just read for us a little bit ago, and there's this detailed, itemized request sheet. I want to go back to Jerusalem. I want to rebuild the temple. Here's what I'm going to need to do it. I need to go down to Lowe's. I need to have a blank check for X amount of dollars because we need to get so many 2x4s, whatever. It's pretty bold, I would think. But what's the king say? You gone, man. You got it. Here's everything you need. He even says in verse 7, "If it please the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fort." And he doesn't say, "We'll pay you back, king, later." He just says, "This is what I want to do, and this is what I'm requesting. Can I do this? Can I use your royal resources to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem?" And the king says, "Go to it." Doesn't seem like it ought to be ringing. Anyway, what's that? Yeah, Mike? If there are, I don't know about them. I know if you read Josephus, of course, Josephus is much later. He's in the time of Christ. But Josephus is extremely detailed, almost too detailed. But Josephus is a... Don't be insulting to the guy now. You may know something about Josephus I don't, but at any rate, that's I don't know of any other account of this than what we have right here. But we know it happened. We know that Israel was taken off into captivity. We know they were gone for 70 years. We know they came back, and they came back full force. They came back and reestablished the temple. They reestablished the city of Jerusalem. They reestablished Judea. That's why when Jesus came on the scene about 500 years after all of this, his nation was in place. The temple was splendid, even more splendid than the one that they've got here, because Herod rebuilt it with gold, and it was a thing to behold. So this is a big deal. Mike and then Bobby.
If you want to learn how ancients handled a shipwreck, you go to the Bible, because the detailed accounts of how the ship that Paul was on went down and what they did while it was in the process of sinking is the only ancient account we have of that kind of detail.
Really?
You know, and the Bible is full of these things like this that are very detailed, and it's the only document that goes into this kind of detail.
And it's all accurate. People have accused the Bible of being inaccurate for centuries, but when it comes down to it, it's always proven to be accurate. Bobby?
I went to verse 6 where it says that in the mind that the queen was also sitting beside him. Was that Esther, or is she pointing out a picture?
No, Artaxerxes was not the king when, I don't think I think that was Ahasuerus. See if I've got that in my notes here.
On that chart, we've got them at Xerxes in 486 to 565, and Artaxerxes at 464 to 423, so that'd only be a year difference.
Xerxes, not Artaxerxes, but Xerxes and Ahasuerus, I think were the same king. Two different names for the same king, and that was the king, that was Esther's king. So Esther would have already been the queen by the time Nehemiah comes on the scene. But y'all already knew that, didn't you? Yeah. No, I'm just kidding, because it's just so hard to keep up with all of this. But think about it. He's cupbearer to the king. If Esther, and apparently she had, I hadn't even thought about that for this, but Esther had been the queen under Ahasuerus. She's a little Jewish girl. Who was her uncle? Mordecai, and Mordecai was given a powerful position in the court. Daniel had been given a very powerful position in the courts of Babylon. Who else along with Daniel? His three compatriots, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. God sends his people out. He scatters them because of their sin, but when they get reestablished in Babylon, he puts them in high positions, powerful positions. I don't think it's just because of his providence. It's also because God raises people up to be competent, trustworthy people. And when men like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, Nehemiah and Ezra, when they give themselves over to the Lord, things happen with their character. Things happen with their integrity. They become people that you can trust. And I'm pretty certain that in that day and age, it was hard to come by competent men who were trustworthy, even if they were foreigners. And so when these kings found these men and these women like Esther in their courts, they said, all right, we got something here. We need to do something with these. This is out of the ordinary. Christians are not the only people who've been lights. God's people, godly people, have been lights all down through the ages. And I think what we're reading here is bearing witness to that, even though that might not be one of the things we typically look at in this situation. Well, that's our second bell. We got to quit. Lord willing, we'll come back next week and get back into Nehemiah.